I could have your attention, please. I'm sorry to interrupt all of your wonderful discussions with each other for a moment, but we've come to, we have this is a little loud, I think. Do we have a technician? Okay, we're working on it. But we've come to a very important time, and that is the Kohut Memorial speech. And we have something to really look forward to today. And I want to introduce just very briefly Ernie Wolf, who will in turn introduce Joe Lichtenberg. Ernie is, as you know, one of the founders of self-psychology. He, of course, was a very close associate and co-author of Kohut, with Kohut, and has contributed a great deal to this field. You all know him, and we thank him for his contributions, and he will introduce Joe.
It is almost ancient history. 59 years ago, in 1946, that a group of about 90 men and women assembled on the lawn in front of a really ancient building, the medical school of the University of Maryland, just a few blocks from here. We were there, the freshman class, for our first day, and about to be ushered into that ancient building to start our education in human anatomy. All we knew was that there would be a bunch of cadavers. That was the fancy technical name for corpses. Awaiting us, I almost said they were ready to welcome us. So they could instruct us in the finer points of flesh and bones. But before entering those hallowed halls, we were told to divide ourselves into groups of 4 each, that is 4 freshmen to a cadaver. I looked around to find a familiar face to help me to face the cadaver I was to be assigned to. I did not see a soul I knew. They were all strangers, mostly all just a couple of weeks out of the Army or Navy like myself. As the nameless and faceless others coalesced into groups of 4, I saw 3 guys who looked as I felt. We kind of nodded to each other, 4 strangers getting ready to go and cut them up. The cutting, of course, refers to the dissecting of the cadavers, and we had brought the usual instruments. Shall we, somebody said? And we had 4 group of 4. Joe Lichtenberg, Jay Biscayr, Larry Demarest, and me. For 3 of us, that was the beginning of a now almost lifelong friendship and collegiality. I don't know what eventually became of Larry, but Joe and Jay, I think they were both with us here tonight, so I haven't seen Jay yet. 59 years later, all 3 of us are psychoanalysts. And I understand Larry, who became an osteopath, and married a psychoanalyst. What a peculiar cadaver, I must say. That stands off from dissecting flesh and bones to the other extreme of medical practice, namely to the integration of thoughts and feelings and history into a cohesive personality. At the time, back in 1946, we did not know much about psychoanalysis, except Joe here. He knew. He had read all of Freud's introductory lectures, plus other basic psychoanalysis writings. And most importantly, Joe knew already that he wanted to become a psychoanalyst. I cannot say how much this aim derives from his feelings or how much emerged from his life experiences. But let me state unequivocally that we all, as individuals or as groups, as a science, indeed, as a world, benefit every day from the fact that Joe has become one of the most outstanding psychoanalysts of our time. Not only is he editor-in-chief of Psychoanalytic Inquiry, a journal that in my judgment is the best and most advanced psychoanalytic periodical, but his own bibliography presents numerous books, scientific papers, discussions, lectures, and other essays that make him the most valuable contemporary contributor to psychoanalytic progress. Joe was the co-founder of Psychoanalytic Inquiry and also of the Institute of Contemporary Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis, of which he has been the director in many years. Through the Institute, he has taught and supervised the training of the elite of the American psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapists. Indeed, his international travels and presentations have made him just as important for the development of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic ideas abroad as in the U.S. From the very beginning, Joe's interest in children has been a major influence in the creation of his outlook on psychoanalytic theories. Joe is clinical professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University and serves on the faculty of both the Washington Psychoanalytic Institute and the Washington School of Psychiatry. He also serves as a supervising analyst at the Institute for the Psychoanalytic Study of Subjectivity and on the editorial board of the Bulletin of the Manager Clinic, Psychoanalytic Dialogue, Psychoanalysis, and Psychotherapy. His own research has resulted in numerous publications, editor-in-chief of Psychoanalytic Inquiry and the Psychoanalytic Inquiry book series. He has co-edited reflections on self-psychology and empathy, Empathy 1 and Empathy 2. He has authored The Talking Cure, Psychoanalysis and Instant Research, Psychoanalysis and Motivation, and the Clinical Exchange. Techniques derived from self and motivational systems, co-authored Self and Motivational Systems, toward a theory of psychoanalytic techniques. Together with Dr. Frank Laughlin and James Kostaki, he written a new book on communicating with our patients. I'm now here facing with the dilemma. I could go on and elaborate in some detail on the various important contributions he has made. But if I did so, I would be encroaching on Joe's time to talk to us here today, and I certainly do not want to do that. So let me just say that Joe's important extension and development of dynamic thinking has put the motivational systems into the center of our approach to clinical problems. For me, it has been a great experience to witness a creative mind at work, and as we listen to his talk to us today, we will be aware of the creativity of his still being active every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernie. I especially appreciate all the clapping now, because then I'm assured I'll at least get it. I was asked by a friend of mine, Curtis Bristol, who had been one of the people I taught ego psychology to when I was the big teacher in our group of ego psychology. And he said, I understand you're interested in something called self-psychology, which I rapidly and proudly acknowledged yes. And he said, well, the meeting is going to start in about 2 minutes, but would you mind telling me what that is? So that became a rather thick now moment as to how to respond to that. So I had an inspiration of the moment, which was to say, well, self-psychology is doing all those things you do and don't tell your supervisor. So my talk is essentially about what lasts and what fades. And my first thought is that there is in that story two things. One is that there is a way of doing things that somehow has a general consensus. Thank God the general consensus changes as to what that is. But nonetheless, there is a frame. There is some way of constituting ourselves and what we do with patients, and that lasts. The form of it may change, but the idea that there is a frame lasts. And hopefully something fades, which is that we now tell our supervisors those very things and with a certain degree of pride about them. So that old prohibition fades. Now, how did we all get into this business? Well, I think essentially we owe our present being of what we are to 2 women and 3 men. The first woman was Anna O, and she said to her doctor, lawyer, listen to me. And by God, he did. A pretty amazing thing. So he, Royer, got interested in what happened as he listened and saw changes and remarkable things that happened. And so he told his friend, Sigmund Freud, and thank God another person listened. Freud listened to what was happening and got very interested and wanted to do something with it, not just sort of have it as an experience. So that started us on the whole process of listening. Then time went on, and how we listened, what we listened to, and how we sort of insisted that we knew what we were doing when we listened and interpreted, led another woman, Miss F, to say to another analyst, Kohut, why don't you just listen? Essentially, and he did. And he started to listen, and he started to recognize that when his listening was enabled him to give her an idea that he heard, that he understood, that he could see things from her point of view. There was a huge change in the whole process. What still lasted was listening. What changed was how to listen and what to listen for. And that is what is with us to this day. But when an analyst, a theoretician analyst, listens at any time, he will make certain guesstimates about how to explain what is going on. And Freud made some guesstimates, Interestingly, his first guesstimate was that people he was hearing had been traumatized. And that something that was a consequence of that trauma was that they had emotions that were not accessible to them. He called them strangulated affects. And he thought that if they could be brought into awareness, symptoms would disappear. And then he made a wrong turn. And the wrong turn was to say, oh, if I really listen to what these people are telling me and what the traumas are that they're describing, they've gone through hell as children. And that can't be. You know, all these parents and all these difficulties that are around in this world, even in my own world, even with my own good mommy and daddy, can't be. It's all distorted. So he said, okay, it's something else. Well, where does the distortion come from? And then, like a good scientist, he borrowed off of the science of his day, which was then hot on energy, Helmholtz, and then Einstein, and of course to this day we're interested in energy, but not as the paradigm for us as animals. So he made a wrong guess. Just consider what psychoanalysis would have looked like if he had stayed with affect and trauma. It would have shortened our journey a heck of a lot, I think. Okay, so that was one wrong guess along the line. Then we move up a little bit to Heinz, and we say, well, what were some of his early guesses? Well, one of his early guesses was that all of the data that was going to be useful to self-psychology had to come out of clinical experience. That is, it had to be derived from that which could be observed in a clinical setting, which was a way of saying, get all this borrowings from physics and all that out of here. It's what's going on in this room, and let's stay in this room. Well, that was a constriction that, fortunately, he didn't hold too tightly to, and because immediately people like Mike Bosch and like myself and like Dan Stern, who were all together in 1980 in Boston, said, infant studies, my God, there's information that is so relevant. And so that was then a change that then moved from what faded was his prohibitive idea, and what remains is our tremendous back and forth informational exchange from the study of infants to the study of what we do every day in our clinical work. So that was then a second important change. Now, Heinz also made another guess, which was that there would be a lot of explanatory use in borrowing the concept of structure from ego psychology, structures of the mind, except we're not going to have macro structures, id-ego and superego. We're going to have another kind of structure, self-structure. We're going to unify, integrate, talk about self, and talk about it as a structure, something with a slow rate of change. That's what the structure meant. And that also seemed to some of us, I remember Ernie and I talking at the Cape and saying, you know, what self-psychology is about experience. And we're going to talk about a self. It's a self-experience, how one experiences oneself in relation to others. So that became then a second turning point, at least for some of us, to redefine things from self and self-object, as if they're just figures, into self, the sense of self, the experience, and into something called a self-object experience, which is either vitalizing or soothing or responsive to some need or another that then alters the state of a person, hopefully for the better. So that was another bet, and that was another way of changing something, so the constriction about structure. Now, what has then happened is that experience doesn't seem like a big enough casement, and it's too, it doesn't have a kind of larger explanatory power. So what happened then is we borrowed, many of us coming from different ends of the whole spectrum, borrowed from systems theory and started to think in terms of systems. And so, well, systems becomes a very complex thing. A system, what is a system? A system is something that self-organizes, tends toward to becoming self-stable, but is also under a great deal of dialectic tension, either within the parts of the system or with other systems, which then forces it to be in constant flux and change, which then means that there's potentiality for reorganization. Okay. That's essentially, in a few words, what a system is. So if you then take the idea of well, then you can say the system, one system is A leads to B. Patient says, I'm angry with you. And you say, what are you angry with me about? And the patient says, I'm angry with you because you didn't show, because you canceled yesterday's hour, and so on. And it sounds like it's a linear progression. But what we discover is that that very rarely is the answer to what's going on. That what's going on is operating at that level, but also at a non-linear, unpredictable level. So therefore, we introduce the concept of non-linear systems, which at times can be linear. So that is a whole other way of thinking about and looking at our field, which changes it and introduces so many other ways to think about and talk about our field on a broader scale, and allows us to connect up with science in a much broader way. And of course, the neurophysiology that we're also using and learning about is also using systems theory so that we are able to be more conversant with other areas in a very useful way. Okay, so the bet on structure, I think, has faded, and the bet on systems is what's with us particularly now. Now, a consequence of all this is that we have introduced so many different languages into our field that going from room to room, as I have done in this meeting, is like a Tower of Babel. I mean, the number of languages we all speak is just absolutely mind-boggling. So it's been one of my particular hobbies, so to speak, to try and take some of the more complex things that are talked about in ways that like are 10 words to describe anything, and each word being very long. I've tried to sort of talk in sort of ordinary language, and to try and so I'm going to try out on you a little bit some ordinary terms which I think have to do with what we're listening to with each other at our theory and what we're listening to with our patients. 3 of them begin with I, and one is an R and one is a C. The I is the first of which is influence. Much of what we're talking about has to do with how one influence is playing out on something. That is, we're talking about, for example, by saying an intersubjective system, we're saying there's an influence going back and forth in a dyad. One person is influencing the other. And as they build their influence back and forth, they build something farther, which is the space between, that which they've created between. And that influences them both as to how they will then proceed. So the influence is one of the broadest ideas. Much of what can be looked at is a question of how is influence, what is influencing? The past is influencing the present. Well, of course it is, but how? And so as we try and study things, we're really trying to study the nature of influence in all kinds of ways. Now I will add to that both Freud and Heinz made a bad bet. And the bad bet was that you could start with an adult and understand what a baby was about. And that was a very bad bet. And so people like Dan Stern and Beatrice and many others, and I've certainly been a part of that, have tried to look from the bottom up to understand things as development, as something to be observed. But there again, the influence, and then we'll use the term linear, it's not linear, it's non-linear. There's a huge amount of unpredictability that comes from when you start from the bottom up as to who we get to be at any point. So this again introduces another way of looking at things. Okay, now the second word I'm going to throw at you is inference. This is the least used of the words. This has to do with the idea that at any given moment in a clinical situation, you are making inferences about what's going on with your patient, what's going on with you, and your patient is making inferences about what's going on with him or her and what's going on with you. And those inferences are going to play out in all kinds of ways that are, some of which are explicit and you can find them, they're right in front of your nose, and some of which are very hard to grab a hold of, but they nonetheless govern. We are cognitive beings as well as affective beings. And as cognitive beings, we are always making inferences. And so some of the most important inferences that are made very early when a child will say, "My mommy is angry with me." Why? What did I do? Well, I'm a bad boy. That's my inference. Or, I'm not a bad boy. She's a mean mommy. She's not being nice to me today. Now, the consequences are going to be very different. If I conclude I'm a bad boy, I'm going to live with one way of living and have all kinds of strategies as to what to do about that inference I've drawn. And if I conclude she's a mean mommy, I'm going to have another set of strategies, and that's going to influence what I do. And if I conclude that my analyst is having a bad day today, then I'm going to work with one set of inferences. And if I conclude that, God, I'm being defensive today, I'm going to work with another set of inferences. And so inferences are happening all the time. And they're unpredictable. It's hard to know. You cannot predict which way the darn thing is going to go at any moment. People will show repetitive patterns in which the tendency will be there. But at some moment, it will not be there. Because we also have flexibility. We didn't have flexibility, we couldn't be treated. So, okay, so that's my second I. My third I has to do with intention. And there's a sort of joke that he who collects the most toys wins. Well, I'd say he who can read intention wins. He who can read the intention of himself and others wins at poker. He who can read the intentions of himself and other wins at safety, how to be safe in the world. He who can read the intentions of others can treat others. So it is very important that we have some way of reading the intentions of others. Now, in Dan's talk, he mentioned an early intention detecting center. So we come equipped with this possibility. Now, an awful lot of the complex talk today about mentalization, about the origins of empathy, about whether you can or cannot sense into the mind of another, and all of that, and whether to what degree we're picking up affect that's coming into us, which can give us an idea of intention, are all fit into the question of, can I guess, make any kind of reasonable assessment about what is the intention of my patient when my patient says in words, I hate you, or I love you? What's the intention? And that's what will tell us what's really going on. Not the words are a component of an intention communication, but they can't be taken at the literal level. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to introduce a way of, for me, useful schema for talking about different kinds of intentions. And I've said that when you look at various situations, one set of intentions will have to do with how do I keep my body going? How do I operate physiologically? How do I protect and regulate and operate in some way that my body state remains in pretty good state? And so I've called that a set of intentions or motivations that have to do with a physiological system. I've also suggested that one of the most important things we have is a set of intentions that have to do with essential intimacy connections with others. And I've borrowed off of attachment research to have a great deal of that information. But look at it. Look at the question of why do people get together? What is it that makes one person want to connect with another? Now, Bowlby gave an answer, which is that the answer is that since there is a risk of danger at all times and a risk of loss, people get together for safety. They get together to establish a way of being with one another that produces a safe base. Okay, that makes good sense. But that's just how to not be in trouble. Kohut said people get together so that one can mirror the other, both can share something of their common humanity, and one can feel that respect and admiration of the other that makes both feel good. Okay, those are all positives. So there's a second answer. To have positive experiences is Kohut's suggestion as to how come there is attachment, why people get together. And Bowlby's answer is for safety. And I will add another one. I think people get together for informational exchange. I think we're in this room largely together for communal connection, the affiliative link to one another, but also for informational exchange. So I think people get together so that we know one another by being informed. I want to know who you are, you want to know who I am, and if I'm your baby, I've got to know who you are. And I've got to have you know who I am. So the informational exchange about us in terms of all kinds of information what's my physiological need and state, and so on, is terribly important. So the informational exchange is one that I would add to that grouping of safety, self-object experience, and informational exchange. Okay, now people are also primed to want to have an initiative to find out what's going on. Every baby scans around to pick up what's going on, what is in my environment, what is happening, and before long says why, and before long answers cause, and then wants somebody to say cause and explain. So the idea of an exploratory system, a system that says, what's it all about, is a powerful system, and the initiative to follow in that system is a part of what you're all doing right now, in trying to make sense of the stuff that I'm telling you. So, but we explore in terms of our own preferences. And some of us have preferences that lead us to be analysts, and some of us have preferences that lead us to be to go into space. Both are exploratory, but we're showing a preference of a very different nature as to what we choose to explore. Okay, then I said we have a tremendous need for the initiative that allows us to tell somebody we don't like something. We have to be able to be aversive in order to get on in the world and to be able to communicate to other people what it is that we need at any time, and especially what we don't need at any time, so that we can orient ourselves and orient others. And all of these are operating in a reciprocal system of mutual influence, but not necessarily, but not equal influence. And the last system is the system of what I make the distinction, which I regard as extremely important, the distinction between a need for sensual enjoyment and a need for sexual excitement. And I think that when Jim and Dan were playing the I Love You game, just as now Jim puts his arm around Dan's shoulder, that's a sensual experience. It's a lovely experience. It's an experience that everyone wants to have. It does not, these guys are not, I don't believe, any way likely go out and have an orgasmic experience based on what has just happened. But if you misread your patient's intention, because your patient says, you know, I'm getting fond of you, meaning that if you take another misdirection Freud took and interpret that as everything sexual is aimed toward orgasmic experience, then you will do your patient a great deal of harm, because you will not allow your patient to talk about the sensual experience that they need to have, that everyone needs to have, the hug, the fondness, the touch. And so people like Jim and Dan and I are trying to bring this back into focus so it can be used within a treatment situation to recognize that initiative and what it means and how it's placed. Okay, now the next one, I'm checking my time, is the idea of regulation. The regulation is, again, a borrowed term. It's something that's often used in biologic stories, but it's a very useful concept, and it's especially useful when we talk about affect and affect states, because many of our patients have terrible times regulating either an addictive initiative, in order to get some kind of affective experience. Or when they begin to have a discrete affect, they can't contain it. So that anger doesn't stay anger, it tends to move toward rage. Or anxiety doesn't stay anxiety, it tends to move toward panic. Happiness can move toward a kind of euphoric denial of danger. So there are many of the affects that we need to look at in terms of how well we and the patient can help influence one another to recognize the need for regulation, the problem that there is at the given moment in the actuality of regulating between the two people. And so that becomes another one of my sort of ordinary English words that I think apply to a great deal of what we're up to. The last one I will mention is communication, because I'm going to suggest my own view, which is that I think communication is is a potential broad term useful for understanding a lot of things within that term. I think a lot of what we've been hearing at this conference and others is how we're operating at a verbal level to communicate. Because we are symbol-using people. Or another way, we're primates who use symbols. And therefore, we are different from other primates. And second of all, at the same time as we are talking and communicating at symbolic levels, and speech is not the only symbol system. Music is a wonderful symbol system. Mathematics is another complex and interesting symbol system. There are a lot of symbol systems. But we're also communicating at all kinds of other levels, and at any moment there is an influence on what is happening at both levels, at the verbal level, at the non-verbal action-like level, what do you want to call it, enactment or what, is going on all the time. The influence is from inside, from one's prior experience as it's playing out. The influence is in terms of the other. I have time for a quick story. I was given a referral in a fashion that I don't think most of us would like to have. I was called by a psychologist, very experienced woman in our community, and she said, "Joe, I want to refer a patient to you. This is a woman who's had 2 or 3 tries with very good analysts, and so she gave up on analysis, and she came to me, to the psychologist, and I started her in psychotherapy, and seemed to be getting along, but she just couldn't connect with people. So I put her in a group, and so she said this is the first time that I've had the experience that the group excluded her. That after a while, they didn't want her to be a part of the group. And I thought, oh my God. And so they said, so she said, and I told her that, you know, it may be that there's some people who can't be treated. But you could have a last chance. If he can't treat you, you can't be treated. No, that's not a way to get a patient. So into my waiting room, I walk out, and there's this very attractive young woman, very nicely dressed, smiles pleasantly, comes into the consulting room, sits down, starts to tell me her story in a very pleasant and relating way. And I'm sitting there with this other information in the back of my head thinking, something doesn't add up here, but it's very strange. Well, I'm motion sensitive, and a bird flew by the window, and I glanced over to the window, And when I glanced back, this lady had crumpled. She just was not there. I was startled. And I said, "Were you bothered when I looked away? Did that upset you?" And she looked up at me and said, "Yes." And I said, "Oh, I guess when we were making eye contact before, it was healthy and holding." She said, "Oh, yes." So then we started, and I found out that as a grown-up, she and her mother could not make eye contact. Her mother would invariably look off of her face, and she would look off her mother's face. But this treatment started at that moment. And knowing that, from there on in, we could keep in tiny, tiny track of the whole thing, and the whole thing worked out very, very well. The woman is married and is a very successful person. I mean, you know, it really worked out well. I think some of all the treatment she had really was sometimes helpful, but nobody dealt with this essential problem of breach in communication. So what happened is, by thinking in terms of we were communicating, we lost it. What happened that we lost it? And how were we going to regain it? To me, was a very useful thing. So I think communication, looked at as a theory word to use on a broader scale, to include words, nonverbal, and also in each person a level of something that's influencing communication that can't be brought into awareness, a non-conscious aspect. And I think that how this is playing out is what I think Dan's work and the Boston group's work is giving us huge information about the moment-to-moment aspect of how this plays, how this interdigitating intentions of trying to grasp hold of one another, trying to regulate what we're doing with one another, trying to explore, and all of the inferences that are being drawn, gives us a huge way of looking at the big puzzle in a way that uses, I think, more or less ordinary language to play with. Okay. Now, so when we think about what lasts and what fades, the significance of listening and sensing into the world of others is not only what lasts, it's what orients and organizes us as self-psychologists. And it can be done in all kinds of ways. The dance people, who I think do remarkably things of being able to sense into the other by using motion and not words as a way of interconnecting. So there are many different ways, but that's what we're about. So I will conclude with another story, and my story is this. A self-psychology had gotten off the ground, and a very exciting thing was being planned by Evie Schwaber and Sam Kaplan in Boston in 1980. 1,000 people came. There was a book to be written about it, which I and Sam Kaplan edited from all of the people who were there. Of course, Evie was there, Dan Stern was there, Beatrice Beebe was there, Ernie was there, and I had the task of giving the first case of an analytic case presented by, quote, a self-psychologist. Well, this was a little weird, I say, because I'd never been trained in Chicago. I had no supervision with Heinz or anyone else in a direct sense. I had a rather unusual self-psychological analysis, which was that after 3 analyses, one of which was like a self-psychology analysis with a candidate when I was a very young person, and then a horrible experience with one of the world's most famous analysts, and then another experience with a very good man, a fine, good, kind man whose edible interpretations were all right, and whose good intentions toward me were always there. He said, okay, get off the couch and you graduated. And so I had my merit badge, and I was now an analyst in the most classical institute in America, right here in Baltimore, psychoanalytic. And I knew that there was a lot of work to be done. So somebody gave me a book to read and write a review for a journal. The book was The Analysis of the Self. And I read the book, and I said something I've never said about any other book I reviewed. I said, this is a classic. And in the meantime, not only was I gaining the information from the book, but I was doing a hell of a lot of very useful self-analysis based on the stuff in the book. So in one sense, I had a self-psychology self-analysis of sorts, if you like. So anyhow, I said to Evie, or to somebody, I think it was Evie, why me? Given that there are all these people in Chicago, all of whom have the background, the right credentials, and I have none of the above. And they said, well, that's exactly the point. If you will be a part of it, and if you say it's worth doing, there are people outside of our group that might listen because you have the positions of prestige in the American psychoanalytic, and you have the sort of broader reputation. So I swallowed and said, okay, okay. So I wrote up my case, and I liked what I wrote, so I felt that, I had something useful to say. And if anybody wants to read it, you can find it in the book that we put out at the time. And I was sitting down, getting ready to go up and give my talk. And I was sitting with my daughter Ann, who's sitting over here now, and Heinz, who was on. So I was sitting here, Ann was there, and Heinz was on the other side of Ann. And I got up, and I'm generally not very anxious. I mean, you can see I can get up here and I can talk, and I'm not terribly anxious. I can do this sort of thing. I was terribly anxious. I was really, because this was something I didn't know, what the hell was going to happen, given that, my lack of credentialed stuff. So I get up, and my daughter Ann, who is very close to me and is close to me, picked up my affect, and it was very clear that she saw her daddy as being anxious and more so than usual. And Heinz leaned over, tapped her on the hand, and said, don't worry, your daddy will do just fine. So, okay. What lasts is that. What lasts is that Heinz picked up the emotion, saw it from within my state of mind, Ann's state of mind, responded directly to that, and just was there at that moment, in that moment, just right. And I heard it, and with my ear as I'm just moving toward the podium, and that was a very sustaining thing. So what lasts is this. The Heinz Kohut that's in my mind, that I carry in my mind, is partly out of a book. But the figure and the immediacy is from that moment, that man who picked that up. And so what I carry in my mind, and I will tell you, it's what we carry in our mind about our own analyst, about our parents, and about our patients that matters. It's the patient in our mind is the one who's being treated, as well as the one who's being treated that we're talking to. And so the patient in my mind from that experience was me, and the analyst in my mind was Heinz, who made that very empathic comment. And it turned out that I stopped being so anxious. I gave my talk. Ernie was one of the discussants, and Ernie said, very nice case, just shows well how self-psychology could work. And the other discussant was Nick Trignette, who said, very nice case, shows exactly how a classical analyst works. And so the Tower of Babel was right there in front of us. Thank you all for listening. Thank you so much.